Hi, everybody. So now you know what the Bellini is, right? Now, you know, in their own way, these three guys have had as much success in Hollywood as anyone. Steven Soderbergh is the Oscar-winning director of Traffic, Erin Brockovich, Out of Sight, Ocean's 11, Contagion, Magic Mike, and so many other movies and series. And he's always been on the cutting edge. And the success of his debut, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, it sold for an unheard of $1 million at Sundance, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, grossed $125 million at the box office, and transformed independent film into big business. And he returned to Sundance in January, 35 years later, came out with a big deal from Neon for Presence, a ghost story that he directed and David Koepp wrote. There were 10 bids, which means all these years later, Steven is still king of the hill. So welcome, Steven Soderbergh.
Thank you.
Now, after starting with the film you just saw, Joe and Anthony Russo won the Emmy for the hit series Arrested Development, and they sent the Marvel Cinematic Universe into the stratosphere. They made 2 Captain America films, which led to 2 Avengers films. The latter, Endgame, became the biggest grossing film of all time at near $2.8 billion. And it's fighting for that title with Avatar, and it depends on which one just got re-released as to what the highest grossing film of all time is. So welcome, Joe and Anthony Russo. Sure. Okay, I'm speaking into this. All right, very good. Now, and these guys have gone on, by the way, to form Agbo, which is a very important company, and they're into all kinds of platforms. And all 3 of these guys really are on the cutting edge of whatever this film business and television businesses are going to become. So, but our focus here is their very first film, Pieces. Now, they came to Slamdance with 50 Italian relatives from Cleveland. They papered Main Street in Park City with posters. The family made sauce every day, but when they showed the film, it didn't go well. Though it turned out that they only needed 1 fan. Russo's explain.
Okay. I like that. Yeah. Throw.
Good handoff.
Yeah.
I was how old were we at the time? I think 23 and 24, right?
This is 97?
Yeah, so 97, all right.
26, 27.
26, 27. Yeah. Well, we made Pieces when we were 23 and 24. It took us 3 years to finish the film. We shot it on credit cards. We were in school at the time. He was in law school, and I was getting an acting degree. And, you know, we were very into Pinter and very into Mamet. And we made this, you know, and the French New Wave. So we kind of mixed them all together in a crazy car crash of a movie and had this, like, very profane, totally absurd, non-linear heist movie that was, you know, as uncommercial as a movie could possibly be. And so we brought it to Slamdance. The Slamdance guys were big fans of it. But we screened it, and, you know, Placer to Town had a packed theater. And by the time the movie was over, at least half the audience had left the theater, maybe more, right? But still sitting in that theater, unbeknownst to us, was this man.
Well, Joe, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to pace us a little bit.
Yes.
So
we've only got an hour, Mike.
Now, you guys were inspired by Robert Rodriguez's film El Mariachi, which came to Sundance around the same time that Steven brought his film to Sundance. Yeah. And you know, he spent $7,000, and it was a triumph. And he went on to have a fabulous career, and you guys spent $30,000. That's like 4 times as much. What happened to you?
Robert Rodriguez
It
lied.
was a lie. We figured it out. But look, the story is, look, in the 1990s, there was this phenomenon where people were making movies from obscure corners of the United States, and Steven Soderbergh kicked off this phenomenon in 1989 with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, making that movie in Baton Rouge. And all of a sudden, there became this dynamic where movies would follow Stevens every year. There was something out of Sundance that was going. When we grew up in Cleveland, the sort of independent cinema house was called the Cedar Lee. So all of a sudden, these obscure movies made for very little money in these random corners outside of Hollywood were all of a sudden showing up on our screens at the Cedar Lee. And when we had heard about the $7,000 figure that Rodriguez claimed, all of a sudden, it seemed possible. It seemed maybe like we could make a movie in our obscure corner of the universe and sort of have it travel somewhere. But to your point, it traveled all the way to Park City, went to the Slam Dance Film Festival, and there was literally zero interest in the film from anybody other than this man over here.
A lot of people say when you make a movie and you get a review in Variety, you've made it. How was that Variety review, if you recall?
It was brutal,
Yeah.
if I remember. I think he hated the film. I thought he had said that, and you corrected me earlier, but I thought it was a better story, that he had said that we should take the film and bury it in our backyard. But I think he said that Scorsese should take Mean Streets and bury it so that nobody else would do a Mean Streets-inspired movie. And to be fair, I don't know. Mean Streets was the biggest influence on it, but
I'm not sure it was.
No, but
it just seemed like a cheap shot.
But regardless, though, people weren't seeing value in the film. But this is why it's important that in the film industry, when artists can sort of use their position within the business to identify other things of value, other people of value, and help those people advance and move forward, because sometimes only artists can see something in a work that has value that the industry necessarily wouldn't see, because maybe it doesn't translate financially.
But now, so tell us what that's like. This would be the worst nightmare for a lot of the people here who hope to be able to make films at some point. So here you are, you have all these people who walk out, and then you learn that all that music that you timed your movie to, these were big hits, and even if you could get the music, it would cost you $1 million, which on your $30,000 film. You're in debt. What's that feeling like?
I mean, look, we had a bit of a punk rock attitude at the time. We made that movie through sheer force of will and sleeping on couches, and we sort of had this attitude of this scrappy Cleveland attitude of well, we can just kind of bang on our drums and play our guitar over here, and if nobody wants to listen, that's okay. We can still have a good time. But I think we did ultimately realize the value in reaching an audience, and also the necessity in reaching an audience, because even though we made the movie for not a lot of money, we burned all that money, and that was painful. We stayed in debt from Pieces for 10 years, because there's more money involved in that, and some of that Steven had put in very graciously. But having someone like him sort of look at the movie and go, hey, I see something that's interesting there. I see something you're doing is interesting. I mean, that made all the difference in the world. I mean, we could have disappeared after that.
So now, let's talk about that, because it was the proverbial three-point shot at the buzzer. Describe that phone call and when it came in from Mr. Soderbergh, and what was that like to suddenly have a lifeline tossed your way?
I don't remember if I got the heads up or not, but I was in film school at the
I
time.
don't remember any of this.
Yeah.
Well, that's because none of it happened.
Yeah. But I picked up the phone. I was in film school. We were living in UCLA student housing. We just had our daughter, Sophia, who was the reason that we're here at St. Andrews hosting this festival. And it's, I mean, it was a crushing defeat, Park City, right? We left with zero contacts. Nobody in the business called. You know, there were some genre elements to it, so I thought, well, at least maybe somebody will think we could handle a genre film. And Stephen called, and he was very matter of fact, and he said, hey, I really dug your movie. Why don't we go get lunch and talk about things? And so Anth was at Columbia at the time. Now this is after we'd made Pieces. He dropped out of law school, which was terrible for our father. And then he went to film school at Columbia, and I was in film school at UCLA. And so he flew out, and we went to lunch at a very cheap Cuban restaurant called Versailles on Venice Boulevard. And we had probably the most important 2-hour conversation of our lives.
Well, now, you said your poor father, so he probably had money in the movie like all your other relatives, and he thought, well, this thing failed, I'm going to lose my investment, but at least I'm getting a lawyer. And so, not that either. Now, so Stephen, why were you at that screening, and were you at all fazed when you watched people walking out like someone had yelled fire?
Sorry, I just want to give a qualifier here before you answer, Stephen, so you don't think you're crazy. People actually, the story gets a little conflated. People didn't walk out of the movie at Slam Dance. They walked out of the movie at the IFFM screening in New York City.
Oh, no, they walked out at Slam Dance, too.
I don't remember people walking out, but I wouldn't have noticed because I was watching the movie. I was there because I'd been there before, and I was there that year with a film, and the people that I knew at the festival had said, if you have time, you should look at this, if you can see this. Wow. And I took that seriously because these were people whose taste I trusted. And so, yeah, it was an example that I think everybody who creates anything that people talk about has to go through, which is, I know what I took from it. Somebody who trashes it in that way, that's a very superficial read on what happened. You know, I was able to look at it and understand what it took to do it, and to do it like that, and to do it there. And so I was like, okay, it was insanely ambitious, this thing. Yeah. I mean, it was dense, it was complicated. There are a lot of shots. There's shots I stole, I told you guys. I'm stealing the slow-mo character walking past a brick wall, and I'm stealing that overhead shot of the gun coming out in the bedroom. I'm stealing that, and they're in the Limey. So, you know, I was just very activated by how activated they were, and it was clear they were grinders. Like this took, you gotta be a termite to do this. You know, you can't, this isn't tossed off. This is the intention behind every decision was obvious to me. And I'm like, well, that's what you're looking for.
Wow.
You know what I mean? This is early, they just started. Jesus. So I'm just looking at it going, that's a thing. Like, that is an absolute thing. So, who are these people? Who are these Italians that have their family like all over the credits? Like, I'm like, who are? Like, they're obviously from Cleveland, but like, who did this? Like, that was like, who are they? So,
well, you know, the thing I've always loved about covering the film business and orbiting it and getting to know guys like you, great artists like all three of you, is that everybody wakes up with a puncher's chance to do something special. And Stephen, you recently told me when you came back to Sundance that when you brought Sex Lies there, the video, it had been financed by Columbia Pictures Video Division. So what kind of expectation did you have for your movie, which became sort of like the dictionary definition of what a Sundance filmmaker would pray for? When you brought it there, what were you expecting?
Nothing. Nothing. There was no value. On paper, the film had no value. The rights that were most, exploitable, which were the home video rights, were already spoken for. And so there was no expectation really for anything other than, maybe people will like it. Maybe it's a resume piece. I mean,
Right.
that's what I went in thinking, is like, oh, maybe it'll get me another job. I just wanted a job. So, it was a very interesting trajectory over 10 days of watching this turn into something, and know at the same time that the only thing that we were all agreed upon before going to that festival is that that would not be the title of the movie. That's what everybody understood. Like, when we get out of there, you're changing that title. And I went, sure.
Wow. And now, is it less expensive to not use capital letters in the title? Is that?
No, but it's interesting that the New York Times, a paper of record and repute, refuses to this day to print the title the way it is registered as a copyright.
Wow.
At the Library of Congress. They refuse, because of their style manual, to like just properly write it out the way it is on screen. They won't do it. It's a tragedy. It's a scandal.
I think they're going to cave one of these years.
I don't, and so I think we
Probably
should
be
stop thinking about it.
Well, that's a sign of a maverick now, isn't it? So now, when you said, Stephen, you just wanted a job, what offer did you and George Clooney, who had Section 8, which was a really interesting company at the time, what offer did you make to these guys? Because it's quite a leap to go from being a fan to somebody who's like, you know what, I see enough here, I'm going to help these guys.
Well, I want them to talk about this, but I'll tee it up by saying they were constantly writing stuff. They were sending, I was like, what are you doing? Well, we're writing. Well, send me what you're writing. And they were writing. They were like the guy at Times Square with the watches. Like they were constantly writing. We were talking earlier. They wrote this really great script called Murray Hill. And I go, it's great. It's too big. Like, this is not going to be your second movie. Like, you've got to scale this back. Like, and again, I understood it was part of just their level of ambition. But I didn't want them to waste their time. And I was like, you've got to find something that's really manageable. And they'd written this adaptation of a wonderful Italian film, and I read it. And I got that. We can do this. Let's do this. It's fun. It's super castable. You can be home. You can make it at home. Like, this seemed like a good next iteration.
Yeah.
And I think you guys can talk about the experience of it, but it confirmed my sense that they knew how to run something. You know what I mean? Like, that's a skill that's not taught in a class when you want to make a movie, is this whole other thing that you've got to deal with that has nothing to do with how you're going to shoot it. It's this whole social, political aspect. And if you don't think that's important, and if you don't think that's worth understanding, you're at the back of the queue.
Well, so you guys are in Cleveland, you're in debt, you're a new dad of a future St. Andrews student. Where did you live? How did you make it work? Because presumably Stephen and George didn't say, hey, listen, kids, and they're peeling off $20 bills. What'd you do?
At that time, I was at UCLA grad school, so we lived off the student loans for as long as we could. Go to school during the day, come home right at night. Anth ended up dropping out of Columbia, moving to Los Angeles, slept on our couch, and we were writing constantly. As Stephen said, we had multiple scripts we were working on, and different ideas, different scales. And it all came out of that lunch that we had. It's a fascinating lunch because we had gotten into movies because of Stephen. It seemed attainable because of Sex, Lies, and Videotape. You know, El Mariachi just made it seem like it was more affordable than we thought. But he really ushered in this era of everybody pick up a camera and tell a story. And so we did that. And then, you know, you should talk about this because it's fascinating, but he, post Sex Lies, made a series of films that were highly independent, highly experimental, and it didn't make huge dollars at the box office. And so when we got to this lunch with him, he was in a headspace of, I've got to figure out a way to craft, you know, my, or to alter my craft so I can make more larger commercial entities. And because you were saying, I won't be able to get anything financed if I don't make somebody some money. And we were these sort of two punks from Cleveland who had made this like very dense, unwatchable from a commercial, any commercial aspect movie. And, we're dilettantes, and we were like, what? You're going to do what? And because we had, in our heads imagined a path, a career of making really radical independent movies. And it got us thinking when we left that lunch about how we were going to work in the business. You did tell us to write. You did say, if you want a career, you should start writing, because you're either going to rely on somebody else to write you something, or you're going to write it yourselves, and you guys are self-starters. You made your first film. You wrote the script. So why don't you go home and start writing scripts?
Yeah, but I think it's interesting, like, to understand the arc there. We were in a completely different place, obviously, than Stephen. Stephen's movie sort of became this phenomenon, his Sundance movie, that kicked off an entire movement, film movement, an industry. And, 8 years later, our movie came through Park City at Slam Dance, the sort of the smaller version of Sundance, and nothing happened. It ended up being the job resume that you thought Sex Lies was going to be for you, right?
It was the opposite.
It couldn't
of
have been
phenomenon.
more opposite, right? So Stephen had this energy as a filmmaker at that time that was completely foreign to us, and that we had never experienced. And so for us, having idolized him and what he had done, that moment where he told us, I think I'm going to have to do a studio movie, and I'm going to work with this TV star, George Clooney, to do it. And Joe and I, we were just like, what are you talking about, Stephen? Why would you do that? And then he's like, well, I can't, everybody knows my movies aren't making any money, so that I can't get my movies financed anymore. And I just remember my head exploding when he said that. Knowing as little as I knew at the time, just this idea that Steven Soderbergh couldn't get a movie financed, I was like, what are you talking about? There is no God, But it was a great lesson for us in terms of watching him engage in Out of Sight, which would go on to become one of his best films. And we got to watch him go through that process. And I think that was an amazing eye-opener for Joe and I, because we had, we had always had a split personality as sort of film fans. We love the multiplex. We love the movies that everybody goes to see collectively and shares together, and roots, gets excited about together and shares with their family and friends. We also liked very obscure art house stuff. And the idea that you could do both really was solidified for us with what he did with Out of Sight.
Well, before we get to Out of Sight, now, Stephen, so you come off, you win the Palme d'Or at Cannes. You are probably the hottest young director in town. And you make Kafka, and you make Schizopolis, you make very personal movies, and you become kind of something else. How much of that was a protective device for you to make it clear you were not going to make Sex, Lies, and Videotape over and over again?
Oh, I don't think I was thinking in those terms. This was early days, and I felt I still was not formed. You know, that's the danger for any young filmmaker who has an early success, is that they get frozen in that moment and think, oh, I just have to do that. That's a trap. And so I knew that, and like I said, I knew I want to try some stuff, but you know, I took it a little far. Like I kind of drove whatever art house, vaguely commercial cred I had into a culvert. And so Out of Sight was a job that I had to fight to get, because I was no longer on these lists. The only list I was on was Casey Silver, who was running Universal, who I'd made King of the Hill and The Underneath for, and who I wrote my very first screenplay for money for in 1985 when he was working at TriStar. I wrote this musical set in Indianapolis, of all places, contemporary. Like, it's the crazy, how, the idea of me being hired to write that, some like kid who grew up in suburban subdivision Baton Rouge is writing this musical about people in Indianapolis under economic stress. It's ridiculous. Like, anyway, but I've seen, man, I worked hard on this. Like, I've gone back. Recently, I burned a gigantic pile of like journals, notebooks. I gotta just get rid of all this. In that were these draft after draft of this thing, like so dense. I'm like, who was that person? Like, it was wild to think of me at, 23, my first job, I'm in the Writers Guild, you know what I mean? And Casey's like a real executive working at a real studio. And boy, that's what I reckon. I was like, I was grinding this thing out. I didn't want anybody to say, like, man, I wanted them to say, like, wow, he worked on this. Like, he worked on it.
Right.
And that's what I saw.
Yeah.
It's like, they work.
Well, in the journey of a filmmaker, I've always felt, as a journalist, I always learn way more in defeat and setbacks than I do when something goes right. So Out of Sight was I had always read Elmore Leonard's novels and loved them. And this was one of the first movies where I was like, damn, this movie is good. How much of what you went through with those movies that probably you felt, oh, no one's going to hire me, how much of that formed the fact that you made this movie and it was just different from all the other Elmore Leonard adaptations? It was sexy, the dialogue just crackled with intelligence and humor and wit, all the stuff that I loved about Elmore's books. How much of that was attributable to you taking your turn in the barrel?
Well, I'll answer this so that I can hand it off, which is, as far as I'm concerned, when you get on the set, you have to act as though there is no clock, there is no money, you just want to get, what you have in mind, which ultimately is supposed to be something that you would stand in line to go see. So in that space, in the case of Out of Sight, I mean, it's a bit of a Jedi mind trick, but the key, I was self-aware enough to go, on set when I'm directing Out of Sight, I need to be as free as I am when I'm on the set of Schizopolis. There is no difference. There is no, the scale ultimately reduces to, is there something happening in front of the camera that's interesting? Doesn't matter if you're talking about $30,000 or $30 million. That is the ultimate question the director is asking. So I just went, I'm allowed to do whatever I want to do, and I did responsibly. I understand this is the trade-off is, you give me a number, if I hit that number, I can do what I want. That's the deal,
Well,
as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I mean, how many of you have seen Out of Sight? There's the love scene between George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez. When I watched it, I thought I was just so moved by it. It was elegant. It didn't feel voyeuristic. It was graceful. You understood the feelings that these two people had for each other, even though they would never be able to be together. And it just was so elegant. And I asked Scott Frank, who went on and did a bunch of Elmore Leonard adaptations, and Get Shorty was one of them. I said, so, how did you guys come up with that? And he said, he said, Stephen just looked at me and he said, I got an idea. And I guess that's sort of what you're talking about. As long as you stay within the guidelines, you can innovate in that sandbox. How did you come up with that scene?
Well, let's talk about theft. This is what I really want you guys to weigh in on. Because this is important. Another word for it is influence, but it's really theft. So what are you stealing? What are you looking at? What do you like? I think you have to believe that you're adding something to it. You're not, when you're early on, you are imitating, but I think your goal and your understanding is, I can't just be recreating something exactly. It needs to be different. I'm standing on somebody's shoulders. Everybody is. Whose shoulders? And what's your sauce? So you guys should talk about that.
Stealing.
I mean, great
But
artists.
what are the rules?
Yeah,
Like,
great
what are
artists
the
don't
rules?
borrow; they steal.
Everybody wants to know, what are the rules?
Well, we look at this is sometimes Joe and I have very unique perspectives on the process because we work as a team, and it gives us a sort of a certain. All of film is collaboration, but because Joe and I collaborate so intimately and for so long, it's like all we do all day long is steal each other's ideas. That's really what our process is. So it feels very natural to us, and we like the idea that ideas flow and they sort of morph as people pass them back and forth with one another. And we get fired by that experience of seeing like how people interpret things differently.
Well, we're also film geeks growing up, so when we communicate on set, we will discuss things in movie terms, i.e. movies we've seen, right? Or directors we commonly love, right? So we can say, hey, a lens like this scene, or what if, the action played out like the French Connection car chase, but, that shot on the wheel, right? So we will constantly refer to a common language because it's very hard to communicate. You're having that conversation in your head with yourself as you're dialing up all the movies you've seen and loved over the years. We actually have to talk it out loud, and people said they find it very humorous to listen to us discuss it because it is just like an encyclopedia of pop culture, It could be a video game we reference, or Dobie Gillis, or it's like a crazy amount of influences all mixed together, and then that's how we get our weird sauce from that. But we do it unabashedly. I mean, we are intertextualists. We like making things that refer to other things. We feel like it's all part of the conversation because we used to hang out with our friends and discuss movies all the time. And we would quote, Full Metal Jacket ad nauseum, or we would quote the Blues Brothers ad nauseum. And so our understanding of movies was about a common conversation and about getting people to talk about them the way you liked to talk about them. So we never felt like it was inappropriate to refer to other stories in your story. We, in fact, found it quite entertaining.
Yeah, well, also, I would add one thing to that, too. We have this belief that the movie, when you have a belief that the movie is bigger than you, that you're serving an idea that's bigger than yourself, and that's something that's different. And it's, we're all doing that, right? We're all sort of chasing an idea that goes beyond ourselves. And I think that circles back to this idea of stealing, It's like, everybody can contribute to what that idea is, whether they're sort of being paid by the production or not.
Well, Stephen, you used the word stealing. I would say, I would probably say more influence, because you take an influence and then you put it into your own language. But if you had to look back at that scene in Out of Sight, who did you steal that from?
Oh, Nick Rogue. It's Don't Look Now. It's the scene where they're getting dressed before they're going out, and it's all sort of splintered and blended. The problem is, my idea of it when we shot Out of Sight was based on a screening that took place 20 years prior. And some years after, when I went back and looked at the scene from Don't Look Now, I watched the whole movie, it's a great movie. But when we got to that scene, I was like, that's not what I remember at all. Like, I had transformed it in my mind to something, I'm not saying it's better, just different. Like, the things I thought I was stealing were there, but very nascent. And I was clearly going, oh, I can nuclearize that kernel. And that's what I was doing. So in my mind, it had transformed into something different. And that was terrifying, because I thought, oh, I got that wrong. I felt like I got it wrong.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I remember that was one of the first movies when we got HBO in our house, and I think I was about 11 or 12. That was the one with where you saw Donald Sutherland's Willie, I think, right?
Don't Look Now. That's. I don't remember that. Thank God.
Okay.
That's a gift.
I think you might have filled that in. Yeah, exactly.
But
well, it was the first time we saw nudity in a movie, I remember, because my mother ran to back then you had to get up off your butt and to shut it off or change the channel. One thing I wanted to ask you, so here you are under the tutelage of Steven Soderbergh, and we know all the things that he had done by then. And then his partner is George Clooney, who would go on to win an Oscar himself and do all kinds of great things as an actor, director, producer. Tell us some specific things that maybe you watched them go through that were valuable to you as you guys were learning the ropes.
There's at least 10 lessons that we learned from Stephen and George that have carried us through our entire career.
please list all of them.
I'll start with number one. By the way, I remember, to be fair, our first reaction to you talking about Out of Sight, and I don't think you remember this, was not that guy from that TV show. oh, please, don't do this. We were like,
you said that.
Yeah, no,
did.
we said that.
We
Yeah,
said
yeah.
that,
That's
yes.
how terminally
that was our
clueless
reaction.
we were at the time.
We were like, this is like a career killer. What do you do? This is crazy. You're going to make a commercial movie with the TV guy, and it's a disaster. Cut to us 5 years later working in television. But
After working with George.
so that was that was the most important lesson. Number one, you can get a great performance with anyone, and anyone can be great, right? Like you can't be prejudicial about what someone has done up to a certain point, because at any moment you could discover what is special about that person. That was probably the most important lesson.
I felt so lucky because it was, to me, obvious he was ready to, like, explode. Like, and just hadn't found the exact right thing. And I knew this is the exact right thing, which is why I was chasing it. Because I was like, how often is this going to happen?
That was
sat in
what
the
was so
theater.
funny. We were in such different places at the time. Like, I remember when we started challenging you about the idea over the table, you got defensive. You were like, "What are you?" But again, this is I only say this in the sense of that Joe and I were coming from a very limited and specific place at that time.
So there are two lessons there. One was you can embrace commercial storytelling and actually tell interesting stories. Two was, at any moment you can discover something fantastic in someone or yourself, right? You could change anyone's perception. Three, because he was a maverick, you told us never let them pigeonhole you. So our careers, if you look at it, like it goes all over the place. We did comedies, we did dramas, we did television, we did films, we did commercials. We've done everything in an attempt to not be pigeonholed. And after Arrested Development, we made sure not to get stuck in comedy and started doing dramas just so we didn't become the comedy guys. Even though we ended up going back to Community because it was a great script, and right. So we moved all over the place, which was very fulfilling, and we never did get pigeonholed, which is how, the narratives are so simplistic, right? Everybody reads about 2 sentences of an article now, and then they make form an opinion and move on. And so at the time, you would have said, many people did, why did they get these TV comedy guys to make this big action movie at Marvel? Well, because, earlier in our careers, we had done genre, right? It's where we started. And we always understood genre and loved genre. If you've seen some of the episodes in Community, you'll know that, the paintball episodes, and, we're constantly, spoofing genre. So that was another lesson we learned from you. Another lesson was never work with assholes, right? And if somebody is an asshole, put them on a list and never take them off, right?
Name some of those assholes.
We're not going to say who catalyzed that lesson that they gave to us, but I remember George was the one who articulated that specifically.
Another lesson. Can you think of one more?
Oh man.
Oh, this is a good one. About when we were working with studios, and you said, it's like when what Steven said is just get to production, because once you're in production, it's like you're in a car going 100 miles an hour on the freeway, and they're like yelling at you as you're driving by, and you're like, fuck off, right? Like there's no way to stop you once you're into production. We've always used that. It's like smile and nod until you get into production, and then go and do what you want, because they can't stop you at that point.
I mean, I will say this too. I mean, the other thing we learned, which we've carried with us throughout the rest of our careers, is just how the way he produced us was. It was with a very so here's two guys. All we've ever done is shoot a movie for $35,000 that Joe was one of the leads in, and all of a sudden Steven is like activating for us a $7.5 million budget, and he's getting us access to actors like William H. Macy and Patricia Clarkson and Sam Rockwell, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of a sudden, we sort of get the keys to the car, and it was an incredibly gentle hand that he used with us. He wasn't never invasive. He was always he was always focused on what we were trying to achieve, and then how he could help dimensionalize that and sort of prepare us for sort of challenges that we hadn't experienced yet coming down the road.
Yeah. It's another important lesson, which is why this festival is here, is when you get power and influence in the business, you use that to hold open the door for the next person. And that's what he did with us, and that's what he's done with dozens of filmmakers. And you know, I think it's his resume is so incredible that it's sometimes overlooked how influential he has been in fostering other filmmakers on their path through the business.
Yeah, and the other rule is life just isn't fair. If you've ever had gotten a good look or been in proximity with George Clooney, life isn't fair.
You know what? The George Clooney lesson when he came to the set of Collinwood, and we were getting ready to shoot with him, and we were waiting for him to sort of get prepared, and we were like, oh, George needs to go in makeup, and it was like, oh no, George doesn't wear makeup.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. We're also, after that conversation at lunch, we ended up on George's will. I don't know if you remember this story.
What?
So we were working this is a crazy story. They opened Section 8, and they only had enough offices for you and George and Ben Cosgrove. And so Anthony and I, while we were trying to get Welcome to Collinwood made, would sit on the couches in the lobby with a phone between us. I think we look like the two hitmen who...
Miller's Crossing, if you remember that.
Been hired to sit in the corner of the office and rough up people who were giving them a tough time. But we're constantly making phone calls to agents, and I remember one day, George, who, by the way, after our lunch with Stephen, turned out to be the most incredible and incredibly talented and lovely human being you could possibly imagine. He opened up the door to his office, and he goes, hey, brothers, come in here. And we get up and we go in there, and he goes, this is my lawyer. We shake his lawyer's hand. He goes, I need you guys to witness my will. And so Anthony and I are the two witnesses on George's will. Yeah.
Now,
We're not going to tell anybody what it said, but yeah.
well, you guys just saw Welcome to Collinwood. Did you like it? Yeah. What I saw was just a very self-assured, confident comic tone. And there were outrageous moments. There were phrases that you guys, I think you made them up, and just terrific performances. So that comes out. And what does that do for you guys in terms of how you were regarded and what it led you to?
I mean,
That movie?
Yeah, didn't do much.
Well,
Thanks.
It
Again.
ended up making $300,000.
we took the keys to the car that Steven gave us, and we crashed it.
Stephen, just to give some context here, had a deal at Warner's at the time because he was making the Ocean's movies with them, and these were very important movies to Warner Brothers. So as a favor, they invested some money into Welcome to Collinwood. They were starting an indie division. Anthony and I were going to be the first guys run through this indie division, and Collinwood ended up costing, I think, around $7.5 million. And it made a grand total of $300,000. I wasn't joking when I said that. It actually made $300,000 total at the box office.
Wow.
But to their testament, they encouraged us to make this personal, wacky, movie that was influenced by, 30 serial comedies like The Bowery Boys. So when you watch the film, the camera actually emulates, the limitations that they had when they were making 30 screwball comedies. It's except for one shot in the movie, it's all fixed to the camera. It's proscenium framing, it's long takes, it's the actors interacting with each other, and there's certain sort of quality to it that harken back to these comedies he and I would sit up late night watching and that we loved. And they encouraged us to make this film. And it did make a ton of money.
But we got very lucky because before the movie came out, this was a point in time where, as all the indie talent was coming through Sundance in the 90s, all of a sudden now in the 2000s, TV was trying to become very cinematic, you know, with the Sopranos and The Shield and all that. So there was this like rush and interest on indie film talent on the parts of like more conventional TV companies. And so we got approached. There was FX wanted to make they had just made The Shield, and they wanted to do a comedy that was sort of similarly like riotous and dark. And so Kevin Riley, who was running FX at the time, came in the edit room and watched the cut, and they hired us to make a show called Lucky. So we luckily had our next job before Collinwood hit the box office. So and that show Lucky ended up, again, the show didn't work for FX ultimately, but that pilot became like an industry favorite. We got more meetings off of that pilot than I think anything ever gave us, and that ended up leading to us getting hired to do Arrested Development.
Well, so then you do Arrested Development and you become Emmy-winning Russo brothers. And then you have a chance to, and then Kevin Feige sees something in you, even though you really had there was no way of predicting that you were superhero guys. And I'm sure you keep in touch with your mentors. And I once visited George Clooney in his office, and the only picture he had on the wall was him in the Batman mask. And he said, I keep it there because I want to remind myself of what not to do. And so when did you go to Steven? Steven, what did you say when these guys are going to do Captain America? Did you say, I wasted my time?
No, they reached out and said, we're up for this job. Will you talk to Kevin Feige about us? And I only had one question, which I probably knew the answer to, but maybe not. Because the one thing that I cannot abide in art, in anything really, is cynicism. What I really, when I first sat down with them and I wanted to know who these people were, the one thing that I was hoping that I would not see is somebody cynical.
Yeah.
I just can't take it. And so, this became a situation which really, for me, begged the question to them, why are you doing this? Because on paper, I don't see the move from here to here. So why are you doing it? I wanted to know what the intention was. And they said, this is our dream job. Wow. We love comic books. We have a huge comic book collection. Like, the reason we reached out is because this is our dream job. And I said, that's all I want to know. I just want to know that you're still the people that I thought I knew.
And then, I don't know if you remember this, she said, and if this works out, you owe me a car. And then you hung up.
What kind of car?
A nice one. The nicest one. But anyway, so I was happy to call Kevin and just advocate for the two of them, because, as I said, they're grinders. Like, they will, you give them this opportunity, they are not going to fail by lack of application of hard work. Like, I never have to worry about that. Nobody's ever going to call me back and go, why did you say we should hire? I knew, like, you just solved a problem.
Well, what I remember from immediately, and your Captain America he was like a bowling ball. I mean, he was just a torrent of energy, and really like running at whatever the next fight was, and it was visceral and exciting, much the way, as Stephen, we were talking about, Out of Sight. You put your own imprint on it, and as I recall, during the two Captain Americas, and into the Avengers, you introduced Tom Holland's Spider-Man, Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther, and a bunch of other characters that became seminal. And you also killed Iron Man and wiped out half of the characters you built up in the, in between in the first Avengers movie. You brought some of them back. How hard was it to end Robert Downey Jr.'s run as Hollywood's highest paid actor?
That's real power.
That was our fuck you moment to the business. It's interesting. I mean, I think we told this story, but when we pitched Robert his death scene, I remember he started tearing up, and I went, "All right, we got it. We did it." Because we had to get it past him. Of course, you're saying to somebody, "We're gonna take away, your payday and your livelihood and everything else," and he has to be ready to let go of it on many levels, emotional level. Right, it's been a decade. This was a redemptive arc for him. We all know Robert's story, and so we were self-aware of all of that when we approached him to have that conversation. He's a very dear friend of ours, and we knew what we were asking of him, but we also felt like it would tell the best story, and that it started with him. It should end with him.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say it was a difficult. Look, it's sort of along the lines of how Stephen articulates things sometimes. That in order for that story to be honest, we felt like that we had to go there with that choice, because you can't just go to these films and have great fun and invest in these characters without sacrifice is important, and it's important on the parts of the characters in those films, but it's also important on the parts of the audience. Right? You have to experience a sense of loss in order to really earn the gain.
Right.
And that was why we felt it was so important that these characters would have to eventually suffer that kind of loss in order to be honest and truthful to the human experience that we're trying to convey.
Well, that's what often was missing in superhero movies. We talked about you also paying it forward and finding talent and endorsing that talent. And here we have these guys that call themselves the Daniels, and they make this movie Swiss Army Man, which is basically the bloated corpse of Harry Potter powering, them across the water.
Farting corpse.
And you basically gave them carte blanche, and what came out of it was Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was a Best Picture winner. Can you explain, much like Stephen did, about what he saw in you guys, what you saw in them and what you saw in that movie that made you say, hey, we can do this, and you did it?
Well, it was identical. It was almost identical. And it was an identical conversation. So I watched the film with my wife and kids. I laughed very hard, and then I teared up at the end. And I went, oh, this is a level of absurdism that takes a very deft hand, and to mix emotion and humor and that kind of, with that level of contrast was exceptional. And then the filmmaking, the craft, the technique, all of the odd gags seemed in camera. And I went, oh, this is, there's a sort of Michel Gondry level of experimentation here. But, these are young guys that almost feels like there's a team behind this that, they've been working with. And I started, doing some research about them, found out that they've been doing commercials and music videos for several years and had built up this reputation as surrealists and very, very polished filmmakers. And so we asked them to lunch, sat with them and said, hey, we are happy to be in the fortunate position of having made these movies. We have gone out and secured financing for our company, and we want to pay it forward. Stephen did this for us. We'd like to do this for you. And literally said, here's a blank check. Tell us what you want to make. And they thought about it. 6 months later, they call us and they say, okay, can we come in and talk? It's this identical process in Collinwood, where they came in and they said, we want to make an action movie. We said, great, what does that look like? And they said, we don't know. We have a vague idea of what it is. And we said, okay, go away, write an outline. They wrote an outline. We talked about the outline. They wrote another outline. We talked about that outline. Then they wrote a 240-page script that was like, you know, every insane idea you could possibly imagine. You know, it's like they were auditioning every possible idea, existential, you know, absurdist idea that they could play with in the film. And then the way we worked with them, which was really interesting because we didn't want to corrupt what was essential about their work, their identity. We just said, hey, you know this thing that happens on page 120 of your 240-page script? That would be really interesting if it happened on page 60. We didn't tell them how to get there. We just said, go take a few months and think about it and come back. And then slowly it went from 240 to 200 to, you know, 160 down to 130. And they were grinders, right? They did the work that they spent 2.5 years developing this with us. And they were grinding it and grinding it. And this is why it was deserving of an Oscar, is because the level of thought and time that they put into it was exceptional. And they worked very, very hard at it. And it had profound emotion behind the absurdism, which is how they avoided being cynical, right? At the end of the day, and that was one thing we kept saying to them was, if you're gonna go through this exercise and you're gonna have credits roll, fake credits roll, you know, 95 minutes into the movie, which is essentially like, you know, pissing on the audience, you have to do something that wins them back. This can't just be an, you know, a lark or an exercise in, you know, how clever you are. You've got to like land this thing emotionally. And I think that was the most important part of the process was, you know, committing to finding a profound, you know, ending for that movie. And that's what led to it, I think, having enough texture to be considered a Best Picture.
A couple other odd parallels to our experience with Steven in terms of our experience with the Daniels were we had stolen something from them prior to sitting down and offering to produce, which was in one of their music videos, they used a lighting effect that we loved and used in Winter Soldier. And then secondly, when that initial sit down we had with them that Joe mentioned, we were explicit about the fact that Steven sort of opened our eyes to sort of possibilities in commercial filmmaking that we hadn't understood before, and that maybe we could sort of be a similar sort of sounding board for them in terms of what their thoughts are and how they move as storytellers. And I think that ended up entering the soup in terms of what that movie became.
You know, last night, and I have to wrap this up in a minute, but last night I watched this short film that started the festival. It's called Last Call. And this director, Harry Holland, and I met him earlier in the day, 25 years old, and this is his first film, and there was a lot on his mind that he conveyed. He could move the camera, and he delivered a gut punch that I kind of really didn't see coming, and I thought, there are certain things that make you feel good about the future of this business. I found that with certain performers, you know, like Zendaya, John David Washington, some directors where you go, all right, this business is going to be okay. But the business has gotten so much harder, and we talked about Participant, which was a financier of An Inconvenient Truth, and Green Book, and Spotlight, and Contagion, Stephen, your movie, which is an important movie and so even relevant. If you watch it right now, it'll scare the hell out of you. You know, what makes you guys positive about the future of the business and the fact that these things that happened to all three of you could happen maybe to some people who are out here in this audience? And is it, could you see a situation where what happened to you can happen to any one of these people?
Of course. I never thought about the odds. Like, I never thought about it. I just thought it's going to happen to somebody. and why not me? But at the same time, you know, my goals were artistic goals. They weren't. I didn't want to be. I didn't want to be famous. I wasn't thinking about that. I wanted to work. Like I wanted to make films. Period.
Right.
Under any circumstances. So that's all I was thinking about. And like I said, you know, intention really matters. Like if I just don't want to, when I talk about cynicism,
Yeah.
I just don't, I'm happy to have an honest argument. I don't want to have an honest argument with a person that's cynical. We're having an argument because we're both here for the same reason, which is the intention to make something good. Like, that's why we're here. And if that's not why you're here, that's where the problem is. So, again, that's how I was raised, that's how I was mentored. And you guys already had that. I could tell that from seeing the film. Like, you can't execute that unless you have a process that is positive. You know what I mean? You can't be assholes and make that, even though it's a movie with assholes in it.
Right.
You know, I could tell, like, this is, like I said, the thing that was underneath it was clear to me, which is, and this is the trick. Does your ambition match your talent? Like, if they're misaligned, there's going to be turbulence, you know.
Any last thoughts from the Russos?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is that maybe it's because we're from Cleveland and we always thought we were underdogs and the city feels like an underdog city. And just to have some context, it's like the Newcastle of the States. Hard-nosed industrial city that gets made fun of a lot. I don't know, I see tremendous hope in the future of the business. And I see it because of what I think a lot of other people are afraid of, which is technology and the advancements in technology. I think that the barrier of entry for filmmaking has always been how much it costs, and how expensive it is. And we're about to, the future holds a much cheaper way to translate your imagination to others. And I think AI is going to be a critical part of that. I think that the battle lines will be around humans maintaining control moving forward, which I think they will. Because we've introduced many technologies in the past that had the potential to allow us to become overtly lazy or disengage. And I don't think we've given up yet. So I think there's real potential for anybody in this audience very soon to tell a story that reaches people around the world.
I think this was a pretty cool conversation, and I love that the three of you took part, and thank you for being so gracious with remembering.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank
Thank you all.